A teenage girl was murdered in her own home, and the police knew exactly who did it. But instead of arresting the killer, they did something far worse. They protected him, destroyed evidence, and sent an innocent man to prison for a crime he didn't commit. This is the story of how one small-town police department became accomplices to murder, how they fabricated evidence against a man they knew was innocent, and how the real killer walked free for decades while an innocent man rotted behind bars. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice in America. It was November 1st, 1985, when 16-year-old Catherine Fuller came home from school to an empty house in rural Pennsylvania. Her parents were at work, her younger brother was at soccer practice, and Catherine had the whole afternoon to herself. She never made it to dinner that night. When her mother walked through the front door at 6:15, she found her daughter's body in the upstairs bathroom, brutally beaten and strangled with her own scarf. The crime scene was horrific. Blood spattered across the white tile walls. Signs of a violent struggle throughout the bathroom and hallway. But what caught the lead detective's attention immediately wasn't the violence. It was what was missing. Catherine's gold necklace, a family heirloom worth several $1,000s, was gone. Her purse had been rifled through, but oddly, the $40 inside was still there. Only the necklace was taken. Within hours, the state police had their first suspect. Kevin Marshall, a 24-year-old drifter who'd been doing odd jobs around town for the past 6 months. He had no connection to Catherine, no history of violence, and a solid alibi. He'd been working at the Henderson farm all afternoon, something that 3 different people could confirm. But Detective Raymond Hughes had a theory, and once Raymond Hughes had a theory, nothing could change his mind. Here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Before Kevin Marshall was even brought in for questioning, Detective Hughes received a phone call. The call came from Thomas Fuller, Catherine's uncle, who also happened to be the town's former police chief. Thomas had retired just 2 years earlier, but he still had friends on the force, still had influence, and according to what would later emerge in court documents, he had information about the crime that he shouldn't have had. Thomas told Detective Hughes that he'd heard rumors around town, rumors about a drifter who'd been asking about the Fuller family, about their wealth, about when they'd be home and when they wouldn't. It was a compelling story, except for one problem. No one else in town had heard these rumors. When investigators later canvassed the neighborhood, not a single person could corroborate Thomas Fuller's claims. But Detective Hughes didn't bother to verify the story. He had his suspect, and that was enough. Kevin Marshall was arrested at the Henderson farm the next morning. He was confused, cooperative, and completely unaware of what was about to happen to him. During the interrogation, which lasted 14 hours, Marshall maintained his innocence. He explained his whereabouts, and provided names of witnesses, and even volunteered to take a polygraph test. Detective Hughes ignored all of it. Instead, he focused on one thing: getting Marshall to confess. The interrogation tapes, which would later be suppressed at trial, show a deeply disturbing pattern. Detective Hughes used every trick in the book. He lied about evidence that didn't exist. He claimed they had witnesses who'd seen Marshall near the Fuller house, witnesses that were never produced. He told Marshall that his DNA had been found at the scene, years before DNA testing was even available to their department. And when Marshall continued to maintain his innocence, Hughes made him an offer: confess to involuntary manslaughter, claim it was an accident, and he'd make sure Marshall got a light sentence. Refuse. And Hughes would make sure he was charged with first-degree murder and face the death penalty. After 14 hours of psychological manipulation, sleep deprivation, and false promises, Kevin Marshall signed a confession. A confession he would recant less than 24 hours later, claiming he'd been coerced. But the damage was done. Now, here's where the real conspiracy begins. 3 days after Marshall's arrest, a local pawn shop owner named Gerald Martinez contacted the police. He had information about Catherine Fuller's necklace. A man had tried to sell it to him the day after the murder. Gerald had found it suspicious because the man seemed nervous, agitated, and was willing to accept far less than the necklace's worth. Gerald had turned him away, but not before getting a good look at him, and that man was not Kevin Marshall. Natty Gerald gave the police a detailed description. White male, approximately 40 years old, 6 feet tall, heavy build, with a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. He even provided a sketch artist with enough detail to create a composite drawing. When that drawing was circulated, multiple people in town immediately recognized the man. It was Daniel Fuller, Catherine's cousin, and the son of former police chief Thomas Fuller. Let that sink in for a moment. The former police chief's son matched the description of the man who tried to pawn the victim's necklace the day after she was murdered, and the current lead detective had received his initial tip from that same former police chief. But instead of bringing Daniel Fuller in for questioning, Detective Hughes did something extraordinary. He buried the report, and Gerald Martinez's statement was filed away in a folder marked miscellaneous tips and was never mentioned again. The composite sketch was never shown to witnesses. Daniel Fuller was never questioned. And when Gerald Martinez followed up 2 weeks later, asking what had happened with his information, he was told by Detective Hughes that they'd investigated it and it had led nowhere, which was impossible because no investigation had ever taken place. Meanwhile, Kevin Marshall's trial was moving forward at record speed. His public defender, a man named Richard Cobb, who was handling 43 cases simultaneously, barely put up a fight. The coerced confession was admitted into evidence. The alibi witnesses from the Henderson farm were never called to testify. The pawn shop owner's statement about the necklace was never disclosed to the defense, a clear violation of Brady rules that require prosecutors to share exculpatory evidence. The prosecution's case was thin, almost non-existent. They had the confession, which Marshall had recanted. They had a theory about motive, claiming Marshall had been obsessed with Catherine, despite no evidence of them ever having met. And they had timeline problems they couldn't explain. The medical examiner placed the time of death between 3:30 and 5 p.m. Kevin Marshall had witnesses placing him at the Henderson farm, which was 17 miles away, from 2 p.m. until after 6 p.m. The prosecution claimed he could have left the farm, driven to the Fuller house, committed the murder, and returned without anyone noticing. It was absurd. But the jury bought it. Kevin Marshall was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He was 24 years old. He would spend the next 32 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. But the story doesn't end there. It gets so much worse. 6 months after Marshall's conviction, Daniel Fuller left town. He moved to Nevada, changed his name to Daniel Cross, and started a new life. And here's the thing. Thomas Fuller, the former police chief and Daniel's father, helped him do it. Bank records that would later surface showed Thomas had given Daniel $25,000, a substantial sum in 1986, right around the time he left Pennsylvania. For 20 years, Daniel lived quietly in Nevada. He got married, had 2 kids, and worked as a mechanic. By all outward appearances, he was a normal guy living a normal life. But normal guys don't wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Normal guys don't develop severe alcoholism and paranoid behavior. Normal guys don't confess to murder while drunk at a bar in Reno. That's exactly what happened in 2006. Daniel Fuller, now Daniel Cross, got drunk at a local dive bar and started talking. He told the bartender and 2 other patrons that he'd killed someone back in Pennsylvania, a girl, his cousin. He said he'd been high on cocaine and had gone to her house to steal money for his habit. She'd come home early and caught him. They'd struggled. He'd panicked and killed her. Then he'd taken her necklace and tried to pawn it, but the pawn shop owner had gotten suspicious, so he'd thrown the necklace in a river and run. One of the patrons was an off-duty police officer named Marcus Webb. He listened to Daniel's confession, and instead of dismissing it as the ramblings of a drunk, he did something remarkable. He believed him. Officer Webb contacted the Pennsylvania State Police and reported what he'd heard. He gave them Daniel's full name, both his current name and his original name, his current address, and his connection to the Fuller family. The response from Pennsylvania was swift and absolute. They weren't interested. Detective Raymond Hughes, now a captain, personally called Officer Webb and told him that they already had their man in prison for the Catherine Fuller murder, that Daniel Fuller had been investigated and cleared at the time, and that a drunken confession in a bar 20 years later wasn't credible evidence. But Marcus Webb wasn't the type to give up easily. He started digging on his own. He contacted the Nevada State Police. He requested case files from Pennsylvania under the Freedom of Information Act, and what he found shocked him. There was no record of Daniel Fuller ever being investigated for Catherine's murder. No interview reports, no alibi checks, nothing. It was as if the police had deliberately avoided looking at him. Webb also found Gerald Martinez, the pawn shop owner, who was still alive and still remembered the man who'd tried to sell him Catherine's necklace. When Webb showed him a photo lineup that included both Kevin Marshall and Daniel Fuller, Gerald immediately and without hesitation identified Daniel Fuller as the man from that day. Not might be, not probably, he was certain. Armed with this information, Officer Webb did something extraordinary. He used his vacation time to fly to Pennsylvania and meet with Kevin Marshall's appellate attorney, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd taken on his case pro bono 3 years earlier. Together, they started building a case for Marshall's innocence. They found the suppressed pawn shop report in the old case files. They found witness statements from the Henderson farm that had never been turned over to the defense. They found Detective Hughes' phone records showing multiple calls with Thomas Fuller in the days leading up to Marshall's arrest, calls that had never been disclosed. They found bank records showing Thomas Fuller's payment to his son. They found Daniel Fuller's confession, recorded by Officer Webb on his phone. In 2008, Sarah Chen filed a motion for a new trial. The evidence was overwhelming. And multiple witnesses, documentary evidence, a confession from the real killer, and proof of police misconduct. It should have been a slam dunk. Instead, it turned into a 3-year legal battle. The district attorney's office fought the motion every step of the way. They claimed the new evidence was insufficient. They argued that Daniel Fuller's confession was inadmissible hearsay. They claimed that the suppressed evidence wouldn't have changed the outcome of the original trial. Captain Raymond Hughes, now retired, gave a deposition where he claimed he'd acted in good faith throughout the investigation, and that any mistakes were honest errors in judgment. But the most shocking part was Thomas Fuller's response. When deposed, the former police chief invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refused to answer any questions about his involvement in the case or his financial support of his son. He died of a heart attack 6 months later, taking whatever he knew to his grave. The legal system moved at a glacial pace. Motions were filed and denied. Appeals were made and rejected. The prosecution offered Kevin Marshall a deal: plead guilty to manslaughter, accept time served, and go free. Marshall refused. He'd spent 30 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He wasn't about to plead guilty to anything. Finally, in 2011, a federal judge ordered a new trial. The judge's ruling was scathing. Though he wrote that the prosecution's conduct in the original trial had been reprehensible, that evidence had been deliberately suppressed, and that Kevin Marshall had been denied his constitutional right to a fair trial. The judge also noted that there was substantial credible evidence pointing to Daniel Fuller as the actual perpetrator. The district attorney's office had a choice. They could retry Kevin Marshall, or they could drop the charges. With Daniel Fuller's confession, the suppressed evidence now public, and their original case falling apart under scrutiny, they made the only choice they could. On August 15, 2011, all charges against Kevin Marshall were dropped. Kevin Marshall walked out of prison at the age of 56. He'd spent 32 years behind bars for a murder he didn't commit. If 32 years stolen from him by a police department more interested in protecting one of their own than in finding justice for a murdered girl. But what about Daniel Fuller? Surely he was arrested and charged with Catherine's murder, right? Wrong. By the time Marshall was exonerated, the statute of limitations had run out on most of the charges they could have brought against Daniel Fuller. And the one charge that had no statute of limitations, first-degree murder, was nearly impossible to prosecute. Daniel's bar confession was hearsay. The pawn shop owner's identification was 3 decades old. The physical evidence from the crime scene had been lost or destroyed years earlier. In 2012, prosecutors in Pennsylvania did bring charges against Daniel Fuller, but without physical evidence, without witnesses to the actual crime, and with only a decades-old drunken confession that Daniel now claimed was a lie, told while blackout drunk, the case was weak. Daniel Fuller's attorney argued that his client had falsely confessed because he was mentally ill, intoxicated, and seeking attention. In 2013, a jury acquitted Daniel Fuller of all charges. Catherine Fuller's real killer walked free. Kevin Marshall received a settlement of $2.3 million from the state of Pennsylvania for his wrongful conviction, roughly $70,000 for each year he spent in prison. No amount of money could give him back the life he lost, the relationships that ended, the decades spent in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. Detective Raymond Hughes never faced charges for suppressing evidence or for his role in the wrongful conviction. He retired with a full pension and benefits. When interviewed by a local newspaper in 2014, he maintained that he'd acted appropriately and that Kevin Marshall's conviction had been based on solid evidence at the time. He never apologized. The other officers involved in the investigation faced no consequences. The prosecutors who withheld evidence faced no consequences. The system that allowed an innocent man to be imprisoned while protecting a killer faced no real reform. Kevin Marshall died in 2019 at the age of 64, just 8 years after his release. His attorney, Sarah Chen, said he never fully recovered from his time in prison, that he struggled with depression, anxiety, and an inability to adjust to life on the outside after spending more than half his life behind bars. This is the story of how they protected the real killer and framed the innocent. It's a story of corruption, of police misconduct, of a system that values loyalty to its own over justice for victims. It's a story that should never have happened, but it did. And it's still happening today, in courtrooms and police stations across this country, where the truth matters less than closing cases and protecting reputations. Catherine Fuller deserved justice. Kevin Marshall deserved freedom. Neither of them got what they deserved because the people sworn to protect and serve chose instead to protect a killer and destroy an innocent man's life. That's the real crime here.